Welcome to LGBT Stories, your go-to channel for emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales from the gay and LGBT community. Today, we have a story that will tug at your heartstrings and leave you questioning the boundaries of love and connection. Imagine a quiet afternoon, a moment of vulnerability, and an unexpected encounter that changes everything. This is the story of how a stepson walked in while I was changing, and what happened next will surprise you. The day my stepson entered my room while I was changing my clothes was one of the craziest and unexpected days of my life. Let me take you back to where it all started. I stood in front of the mirror, lost in thought as I adjusted the collar of my shirt. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. My wife was away on yet another business trip, leaving me to fend off the creeping loneliness that seemed to haunt these empty walls. It had become a routine. Her brief appearances at home, followed by long stretches of absence. I had tried to convince myself that her career-driven ambition was admirable, but the truth was it left me feeling more like a ghost in my own home. My wife's son had recently moved back in after finishing college. He was polite, respectful, and surprisingly helpful around the house. At 21, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that was both endearing and intriguing. His presence was a welcome change in an otherwise monotonous household. Yet over time, I began to notice things: fleeting glances, lingering smiles, the way his hand would brush against mine when we passed each other in the hallway. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, he was my stepson and I was a married man. That afternoon, the sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting streaks of golden light across the room. I had decided to change into something more comfortable after finishing my chores. Peeling off my shirt, I stood in front of the full-length mirror, staring at my reflection. My undershirt clung to my torso, and for a moment, I allowed myself to wonder if I still looked fit, still looked desirable. It had been years since I felt truly seen by my wife. Her attention had long been diverted elsewhere. Her phone, her friends, endless projects that always seemed to take priority over me. I reached for a lightweight robe draped over the chair near the bed. The cool fabric brushed against my fingers as I pulled my undershirt over my head. The sudden creak of the door startled me. My heart leapt, and I instinctively clutched the robe to my chest, spinning around. Standing in the doorway was my stepson. His eyes widened in surprise, his expression shifting from shock to something I couldn't quite place. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he stammered, taking a step back. "I didn't know you were. I thought you were downstairs." The silence that followed was deafening. My pulse thundered in my ears as I struggled to find my voice. "It's fine," I managed, though my cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I didn't hear you come in." He hesitated, his gaze flicking between my face and the robe clutched tightly in my hands. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice soft but strained. "I'll go." But before he could leave, I blurted out, "Wait." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. He paused, turning back to face me. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't know why I had stopped him. Maybe it was the loneliness clawing at my chest, or the way his presence filled the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "It's okay," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "You don't have to leave. I was just caught off guard." He nodded slowly, stepping back into the room. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his tone sincere. "You didn't," I replied, though my heart was still racing. "I just wasn't expecting anyone." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, thick with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, and despite my embarrassment, I couldn't bring myself to look away. "You're sure you're okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal, or at least it felt like one. The way he was looking at me, the way my skin tingled under his gaze, was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was as though time had slowed, and the only thing that mattered was the space between us. "I should probably go," he said again, though he made no move to leave. "You don't have to," I said, surprising myself with the words. It's nice to have company. His expression softened, the corners of his mouth lifting into a small smile. Okay, he said simply, leaning against the door frame. If you're sure. I nodded, my grip on the robe loosening slightly. I'm sure. For the next few moments, we stood there in silence, the weight of the unspoken stretching between us. I felt a rush of heat flood my cheeks as his eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. There was something in his gaze, something that made my breath catch and my heart pound in my chest. Daniel, he said softly, breaking the silence. You've been different lately. Are you okay? The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. I'm fine, I said, though the words felt hollow. Just tired, I guess. You don't have to pretend, he said, his tone gentle but firm. I can tell something's been bothering you. His sincerity disarmed me, and for a moment, I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to crumble. It's nothing, I said finally, though my voice wavered. Just life. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. You don't have to go through it alone, you know. I'm here. The vulnerability in his words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes searching mine. Anytime, he said simply. I watched him linger in the doorway, his hand brushing against the frame as if he were reluctant to leave. There's a nervous energy in the room, a tension that seemed to pulse between us. My heart pounded as I tightened the robe around me, though the fabric felt heavy and constricting. Samuel, I said softly, my voice barely audible. He stopped, turning back to face me, his expression unreadable. Yes, he asked, his tone gentle, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. You don't have to go, I said, surprising myself with the words. I mean, if you want to stay and talk, that's fine. For a moment, he didn't respond. His eyes met mine, steady and searching, as if trying to decipher what I meant. Slowly, he stepped further into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low and cautious. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable, I replied quickly, though my cheeks flushed at the lie. I was anything but comfortable. My pulse was racing, my hands trembled slightly, and my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and longing. But I didn't want him to leave, not yet. He hesitated before crossing the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though testing the waters. He stopped a few feet from where I sat, his gaze flicking to the robe clutched tightly around me before returning to my face. You seem different lately, he said softly. I let out a nervous laugh, my fingers fidgeting with the edge of the robe. Life has a way of doing that to you, I replied. It's nothing serious, just loneliness, I guess. His brows furrowed, a flicker of concern crossing his features. Loneliness, he echoed. But you're married. Marissa's always busy. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Always working, always somewhere else. The bitterness in my tone surprised even me, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed by my own outburst. I'm sorry, I murmured. That's not fair to you, he said quickly, his voice firm but kind. You deserve to feel seen, Daniel. You deserve to feel important. The sincerity in his words took my breath away. I glanced up at him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that made it impossible to look away. I don't know if I even remember what that feels like. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air between us, vulnerable and heavy, but I didn't regret saying it. It was the truth, and for once, I didn't want to hide it. You're important, he said softly, taking another step closer. I see you, and I don't think you realize how much you matter. My breath caught in my throat as his words sank in. The warmth in his voice, the intensity in his eyes, was overwhelming. I felt my defenses begin to crumble, the walls I had built around myself slowly falling away. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. You don't know how much that means to me. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The contact was brief, barely more than a touch, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked down at our hands, his fingers hovering just inches from mine, and felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name. "Daniel," he said softly, his voice laced with hesitation. "I don't want to overstep, but I care about you a lot." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air growing heavy with unspoken words and emotions. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse racing as I tried to process what he was saying. "Samuel," I began, but my voice faltered. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the storm of emotion swirling inside me. "I mean it," he continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "You've always been so kind to me, so understanding. And I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." I stared at him, my mind racing. His words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the depths of my own loneliness and self-doubt. But they were also dangerous, tempting me to cross a line I wasn't sure I could ever come back from. "I don't know what to say," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is complicated." He finished for me, a small smile hugging at the corner of his lips. "I know, but it doesn't make it any less real." He took another step closer, and I felt my breath hitch as the distance between us dwindled to almost nothing. His hand reached out again, this time resting gently on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch seeped through the fabric of the robe, sending a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to feel alone," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "Not with me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as his words echoed in my mind. "Samuel," I began, but before I could say anything more, his fingers brushed against my cheek, tilting my face up to meet his. The touch was tender, almost hesitant, as though he were waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my heart pounding in my chest as his gaze locked with mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. "If you want me to, just say the word." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension between us was unbearable, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. Slowly, he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, and I felt my resolve crumble completely. When his lips finally met mine, it was soft at first, a tentative, almost questioning kiss. But as I responded, as I let myself sink into the moment, it deepened. The hesitation melted away. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the robe slip slightly from my shoulders. Every nerve in my body was alive, every touch sending a jolt of electricity coursing through me. The kiss grew more urgent, more desperate, and I felt myself losing control, giving in to the passion that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. This wasn't just a kiss, it was an escape, a release, a way to feel alive again. As his hands roamed my back, as his lips moved with mine, I knew there was no turning back. But the craziest part was that this was only the beginning. His hands found the edge of the robe, hanging loosely over my shoulders, his fingers brushing against the soft fabric before trailing down to the curve of my waist. I shivered at his touch, feeling the heat of his palms through the thin material. Every inch of me seemed to burn with anticipation, with a longing I hadn't felt in years. "Daniel," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something that left me breathless and trembling. I pulled back slightly, my chest heaving as I tried to steady myself. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, pleading, as if asking for permission to continue. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, and yet I couldn't bring myself to step away. The world outside this room felt distant and unimportant, and all I could focus on was him. His touch, his warmth, the way his gaze made me feel like I was the only person in the world. "I shouldn't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But even as I said the words, I didn't move. My hands rested on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingertips. It matched my own racing pulse, a rhythm that seemed to bind us together in a way I couldn't explain. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Samuel said softly, his tone filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart ache. "I just want you to know how much you mean to me. That's all." His words broke through the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. When was the last time someone had spoken to me like this? When was the last time I had felt seen, truly seen by someone? I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice trembling as I looked up at him. I don't know how to feel about any of this. You don't have to know, he replied, his hand brushing a strand of hair away from my face. We can figure out together, one step at a time. The sincerity in his voice, the gentleness in his touch, it was all too much. I felt my defenses crumble completely, the walls I had built around myself shattering under the weight of his gaze. Slowly, I leaned into him, letting my forehead rest against his as I closed my eyes. I'm scared, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Me too, he admitted, his breath warm against my skin. But I don't want to let fear stop us. From this, I echoed, the word hanging in the air between us. I didn't know what it meant, what it would lead to, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. It was like gravity, an unstoppable force drawing us closer together. When he kissed me again, it was slower this time, more deliberate. His hands moved to my shoulders, gently sliding the robe down my arms until it pooled at my feet. I gasped softly, the cool air of the room contrasting with the heat of his touch. His lips never left mine as he guided me backward, and before I knew it, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees as his eyes searched mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes," I said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sure." The tension between us thickened as he leaned in. My hands found their way to his hair, tangling in the soft strands as I tilted my head back, letting myself get lost in the moment. Every touch, every kiss sent shivers down my spine, igniting a fire within me that I couldn't ignore. "Samuel," I murmured, his name escaping my lips like a prayer. He responded with a low hum, the sensation electrifying. It was a mix of tenderness and urgency that left me breathless. I felt myself relax under his touch, the tension in my body melting away as I surrendered completely to the moment. There was no room for doubt or fear, only the overwhelming need to connect, to let go of everything that had held me back for so long. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice low and filled with awe. The sincerity in his tone sent a rush of warmth through me, and I felt tears sting my eyes once again. How had I gone so long without hearing words like that? Without feeling like this? I confessed, my voice trembling with emotion. "You make me feel alive." "You don't have to explain," he replied, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me deeply. "I feel it too." Time seemed to stand still as we lost ourselves in each other. The outside world faded into insignificance. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a revelation, a reminder of what it meant to truly connect with someone. And as the moment stretched on, I realized that I didn't want it to end. "I don't want to lose this," I said softly, my voice barely audible. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he promised, his gaze steady and filled with determination. "I'm not going anywhere." His words were a balm to my soul, soothing the ache of loneliness that had plagued me for so long. I clung to him, letting his presence fill the empty spaces in my heart. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. As the night wore on, the boundaries between us blurred, and I stopped caring about what was right or wrong. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, the way he reminded me of who I was, of what it meant to be alive. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. "You're shaking," he said softly, his thumb brushing along my jawline as his eyes met mine. I nodded, unable to speak. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I was trembling from nerves or anticipation. Maybe it was both. Either way, I felt raw, exposed in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice so gentle it made my chest ache. "We could take our time. I'm not going anywhere." Something in his words, in the sincerity of his tone, settled the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling inside me. I exhaled shakily, leaning into his touch as I let myself believe him, let myself trust him. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating to let go of the walls I had spent so long building around my heart. I've spent so much time feeling invisible, I admitted, my voice barely audible, like I was just existing. But with you, I feel seen. You are seen, he replied, his hands steady as they held me. And you deserve so much more than just existing. The weight of his words hit me hard, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I blinked rapidly, trying to keep them at bay, but one escaped, slipping down my cheek before I could brush it away. Samuel leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to the tear's path. The tenderness of the gesture made my breath catch, and I felt my resolve crumble completely. I don't know how to do this, I said, my voice trembling, but I don't want to stop. We don't have to figure everything out right now, he said, his forehead resting against mine. Let's just be here together. His words were grounding, anchoring me to the present moment in a way I hadn't felt in years. Slowly, I leaned in, letting my lips brush against his in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate. It was as if I was afraid the moment would disappear if I didn't hold on to it tightly enough. Samuel responded immediately, his hands moving to my waist as he pulled me closer. The kiss deepened, and I felt the weight of my worries start to melt away. His touch was confident but careful, as though he was afraid of breaking me. It was intoxicating, the way he seemed to put all of his focus on me, on making me feel wanted. As his hands moved along my sides, tracing the curve of my body, I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the feeling of being desired, of being cared for in a way that went beyond words. You're beautiful, he murmured, his voice low and filled with reverence. I've always thought so. His confession sent a shiver down my spine, and I pulled back slightly to look at him. The intensity in his gaze was almost too much to bear, but I couldn't look away. There was no hesitation in his expression, no doubt. He meant every word. Samuel, I started, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That I was terrified? That I had spent so long feeling unworthy of this kind of tension that I didn't know how to accept it now that it was in front of me? You don't have to say anything, he said gently, his hands moving to cup my face. I just want you to know how I feel. That's all. The honesty in his voice made my chest ache, and I felt myself leaning into his touch again. Slowly, deliberately, I let my hand slide up his arms, feeling the strength in his muscles as I moved closer. He let out a soft breath as I pressed my forehead to his, my heart pounding against my ribs. I'm scared, I admitted again, the words trembling on my lips. But I don't want to stop. Then we won't, he said simply, his voice steady and sure. I'll take care of you, Daniel. I promise. The conviction in his words, the way he said my name with so much care, made my knees feel weak. I let him guide me backward, my body sinking into the softness of the bed as he hovered over me. His hands moved with a precision that was both comforting and thrilling, his touch igniting every nerve ending as he explored. Eventually, a silence lingered. I don't think you even realize how amazing you are, he said, breaking the silence. His words sent a rush of emotion through me, and I felt tears prick my eyes once again. I've spent so long feeling forgotten, I confessed, my voice breaking. But you make me feel like I matter. You do matter, he said firmly, his hands stilling as he looked into my eyes. More than you know. The sincerity in his gaze, the way his voice carried so much emotion, left me breathless. I reached up, cupping his face in my hands, as I let myself believe him. In that moment, it didn't matter what was right or wrong. All that mattered was the connection we shared, the way he made me feel like I was worth something again. I don't know what's going to happen next, I said softly, my voice barely audible. But I don't want this to end. It doesn't have to, he replied, his hand gently stroking my hair. We'll figure out together. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. And as I lay there in his arms, I realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I wasn't alone anymore. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was comforting, a blanket that wrapped around us as we lay tangled together on the bed. Samuel's hand rested lightly on my back, tracing slow, soothing circles that sent a ripple of calm through me. My head lay on his chest, the steady rise and fall of his breathing grounding me in the reality of what had just happened. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive, in the quiet intimacy that had settled between us. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, letting it anchor me to this moment. The world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only him, his warmth, his presence, the way his touch made me feel whole again. "I don't want this to end," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's hand stilled for a moment, and then he tightened his hold around me, pulling me closer. "It doesn't have to," he said softly. "Not if we don't want it to." His words were reassuring, but they couldn't quiet the questions swirling in my mind. What would this mean for us? For the delicate balance of our lives? For my marriage? I hadn't allowed myself to think about Marissa during the heat of the moment, but now her presence loomed like a shadow in the back of my mind, a reminder of the choices I'd made and the boundaries I'd crossed. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to go back to normal after this." Samuel shifted slightly, propping himself up on one elbow so that he could look down at me. His gaze was steady, filled with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "You don't have to be scared," he said, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. "We'll figure it out together." "But how?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my uncertainty. "How can we go on like this without? We don't have to have all the answers right now," he interrupted gently. "Let's just take it one step at a time." His calmness was disarming, and I found myself nodding despite the chaos in my mind. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he held me, that made me believe we could find a way forward, even if I couldn't see the path yet. "I don't deserve you," I said, my voice barely audible. "You deserve so much more than you think," he replied, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "And I'm not going anywhere, Daniel. Not unless you want me to." His words sent a wave of relief through me, and I felt tears prick my eyes once again. I leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his lips, letting it convey all the emotions I couldn't put into words. He responded immediately, his hand sliding up to cradle the back of my head as he deepened the kiss. It wasn't hurried or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart ache. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We'll figure it out." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope stir within me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, wanted, and cared for. And that was something I wasn't willing to let go of. As the minutes passed, the room grew darker. The sunlight, streaming through the curtains, faded into the soft glow of twilight. The stillness was comforting, but the reality of our situation lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to be ignored. I knew we couldn't stay like this forever. Sooner or later, we would have to face the consequences of what we had done. "I should go," Samuel said finally, his voice reluctant. I tensed at his words, my heart clenching at the thought of him leaving. "You don't have to," I said quickly, my voice tinged with desperation. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't want to," he admitted, "but I don't want to make this harder for you either." I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. "Just stay a little longer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening as he lay back down beside me, pulling me into his arms once more. I rested my head on his chest, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothe my racing thoughts. For now, I wanted to hold on to this moment for as long as I could. The hours slipped by in a blur of quiet conversation and tender touches. We talked about everything and nothing, our words punctuated by moments of silence that felt just as meaningful. Samuel's presence was a balm to my fractured soul, and I found myself clinging to him like a lifeline. As the night deepened, the reality of our situation began to sink in. I knew we couldn't keep this a secret forever. Sooner or later, Marissa would notice the changes in me, the shifts in our dynamic. And what would I say to her then? How could I explain what had happened without tearing our lives apart? I don't know how to do this, I confessed, my voice trembling. You don't have to figure it out alone, Samuel said, his hand stroking my hair. I'll be here, no matter what. His reassurance was comforting, but it couldn't erase the weight of the choices I had made. As much as I wanted to believe that we could find a way to navigate this, I knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Promise me something, I said, looking up at him. Anything, he replied without hesitation. Promise me you won't regret this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Promise me you won't hate me for what we've done. He cupped my face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. I could never hate you, he said firmly, and I don't regret a single moment. His words brought tears to my eyes, and I leaned into his touch, letting myself believe him. For now, I wanted to hold on to the hope that we could make this work, that we could find a way to be together without losing ourselves in the process. The night stretched on, and as we lay there in each other's arms, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope for a future, for happiness, for love. The aftermath of what had transpired between Samuel and me was nothing short of a whirlwind. The morning after our stolen night together, the weight of reality pressed down on me like an anchor. The house was silent, but my thoughts were deafening. Every moment replayed itself in my mind, the intensity of what we'd shared contrasting starkly with the consequences that loomed just beyond the horizon. Samuel had left before dawn, his departure marked by a lingering kiss and a whispered promise that we'd figure things out. I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the driveway, and for the first time, I felt truly alone. The room still carried his warmth, the faint scent of his cologne hanging in the air, but it did little to soothe the gnawing ache in my chest. When Marissa returned later that morning, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, I found myself struggling to act normal. Her casual greetings, her predictable routine, it all felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I forced myself to smile, to answer her questions, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of guilt and longing. Over the days that followed, I couldn't escape the shadow of what Samuel and I had done. The memories were vivid, burning bright against the backdrop of my otherwise monotonous life. But so were the doubts, the fears, the endless questions that kept me awake at night. How could we possibly keep this secret? And even if we could, what kind of life would that be? Living in the shadows, constantly looking over our shoulders? Samuel and I managed to steal a few moments together here and there, but they were fleeting, filled with whispered reassurances and stolen touches. The tension between us was palpable, but so was the uncertainty. Every time I saw him, my heart raced with equal parts excitement and dread. We were walking a tightrope, and one misstep could send everything crashing down. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the television, Samuel appeared in the doorway. His expression was guarded, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil he was feeling. Without a word, he crossed the room and sat beside me. His presence was both comforting and unsettling. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. I nodded, my throat tightening as I braced myself for what was coming. I knew what he was going to say. I had known for a while. We couldn't keep going like this. It wasn't fair to me, to him, or to Marissa, but admitting it, saying it out loud, made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. "I don't regret what happened," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't keep going like this. It's not fair to you or to Marissa." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to let this go." Samuel reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We have to try," he said softly, "because if we don't, it's going to destroy us." The truth of his words was undeniable, but it didn't make them any easier to hear. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we could make it work, that we could find a way to be together without losing everything. But deep down, I knew he was right. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, painfully, we began to distance ourselves. The stolen glances became fewer, the quiet moments of connection rarer. It was agonizing, like tearing a piece of myself away every time I saw him, and had to pretend that nothing had happened. But it was necessary, for my sake, for his, for the fragile balance of our lives. Marissa, blissfully unaware of the storm that had raged beneath her roof, remained unchanged. Her routines, her habits, her distant affection, they all stayed the same. And yet, I couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. The guilt was suffocating, a constant reminder of the lines I had crossed and the promises I had broken. Samuel, for his part, threw himself into his job search. His days were filled with interviews and networking. I admired his determination, even as it created a new distance between us. It was easier this way, I told myself. Easier to pretend that we were just two people navigating the complexities of life under the same roof. But the truth was, I missed him. I missed the way he made me feel alive, seen, understood. I missed the connection we had shared, the spark that had reignited something in me I thought was long gone. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a pang of longing so intense it took my breath away. I thought of Samuel, of the way his touch had made me feel, of the quiet strength in his voice when he had told me we had to let go. And I realized that no matter how much time passed, a part of me would always carry him with me. The aftermath of our story wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't dramatic or catastrophic. It was quiet, a slow unraveling of something that had burned too brightly to last. But it was no less significant. Samuel had changed me, had awakened something in me that I couldn't ignore. And though we had gone our separate ways, I knew that I would never forget the time we had shared. As I lay there in the darkness, I made a silent promise to myself to take what I had learned, to find a way to move forward, to seek out the happiness I had been longing for. It wouldn't be easy, but I owed it to myself and to Samuel to try. So still, till now, I just really don't know what to think of all of this. What do you think of it? Is it wrong what I have done? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional and heart-wrenching tales. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.